Thanks so much for the kind introduction. We'll bring Premier Evie here from BC next, just to keep going up. Look, it's an absolute honor to be here with you tonight. And Ahmed, thank you. It's always refreshing to hear your perspective on solving what I view to be one of the biggest economic bottlenecks facing Canada's future prosperity. If we can't get housing right, very few other things are going to fall into place. Ahmed and I have a bit of a running joke. We sit next to each other in the House of Commons, and I'll periodically say, Ahmed, look, if we're going to keep increasing immigration levels, are you going to be able to make sure everybody has a place to live? And he says, well, that depends. Are you going to bring in the people to build the houses so we can continue to perpetuate this virtuous circle? But there's some truth in that joke. The reality is we need to keep increasing our immigration ambition in order to fill certain social and economic goals, but we do need to do it in an intelligent way if we're going to minimize social pressures and use immigration to alleviate them rather than exacerbate some of the concerns that we have around housing, healthcare, community infrastructure, and other similar kinds of challenges. It can be a daunting task when you try to figure out how many people Canada ought to be welcoming each year. How can we design immigration policies that will maximize the economic impact? But the reality is, I find after close to 8 years now in this industry, I think we have the bad habit sometimes of making simple problems seem complicated just because they're big. But the solution, from my point of view, is from a population growth point of view, can be boiled down to a simple principle, and it's that Canada needs more people. We need more people for economic reasons. We need more people for demographic reasons. To understand the impact that immigration can have and the opportunity staring us in the face right now, I think it's important to consider the economic context in which we find ourselves. We've just been through some uniquely challenging years with the COVID-19 pandemic, and we find ourselves, as the world opens up from COVID-19, competing globally for the same pool of talent that every other advanced economy in the world is competing for. We have a unique advantage in Canada that we have a fairly limited amount of political controversy when it comes to welcoming large numbers of newcomers. I think this stems in part from our history. It's unique in Canada to most countries in the world that, with the exception of Indigenous communities, everybody's family started here coming from somewhere else. Mine happened to come from Scotland 250 years ago. There's families who arrived over the last few days from Afghanistan in my home province of Nova Scotia. But over the course of our nation's history, we continue to welcome communities from different parts of the world who establish a foothold in this country, and for generations thereafter continue to make positive contributions. When Canadians are accustomed to seeing newcomer families provide health care, build their homes, work alongside them, they come to understand that immigration is a good thing for our communities, and it's an essential thing for our economies. This is an advantage that not every country in the world has, and Canada is uniquely positioned to take advantage of this. Look, we're coming out of the pandemic recession with the strongest growth of any G7 economy. We've got a better GDP than we had before the pandemic. Our rate of unemployment is more or less at the all-time low. There are more people working today in Canada than at any point in Canada's history. And despite these positive economic trends, which I could spit at you for the next 10 minutes without taking a breath, we had almost 1 million jobs open in the economy just a few months ago. Today the number's not quite so dramatic, but it's still in excess of 700,000. The reality is we need to do everything we can to train people in Canada to do the work that's essential to build more houses and contribute to our economy. We need to do more to pull marginalized groups into the economy, whether we're talking about women who've historically been excluded from economic opportunities, racialized and ethnic communities, whether it's Canadians living with disabilities. We need to pull every lever at our disposal to make sure we bring people into the economy and train them to do the jobs that are necessary. But if we pull out all the stops, we are not going to be able to fill the existing demand in the economy with the domestic labor force. We need to continue to grow our immigration ambition if we're going to maximize the economic potential that is staring us in the face right now. 100% of our population growth is more or less coming from immigration right now. Virtually the same thing is true about our labor force growth. We are going to continue to experience growth or not on the basis of our immigration policy. Now, we need a lot of other things to fall into place to make sure that comes true. But if the other things fall into place, including our housing policy, and we continue to welcome large numbers of skilled newcomers to Canada, there's no stopping us, folks. We will outpace growth for our G7 counterparts for a generation if we continue to embrace immigration the way we have been. But it's not just the short-term labor needs that we need to address. There are long-term predictable skills gaps in the Canadian economy that we need to fill through immigration and other measures. Look at the demographic challenge that is facing Canada today. If you rewind the clock half a century, there were 7 workers for every retired person in Canada. Today there's about 3. In Atlantic Canada, where I come from, the number's closer to 2. And that's the trajectory we're on for the entire country by the time I retire. 2 workers for every retired person. Let me tell you from personal experience how that manifests in communities in Canada. When I first ran for office, we were coming out of a multi-generational trend in Nova Scotia of young people moving out west or to Toronto or some other country to find an opportunity to work. I know I was one of them. I spent about 5 years in Calgary paying off student loans. The reality is, this is true not just for my own experience or my own families, but for so many people who come from small town Canada, who come from rural Canada. The controversies during that 2015 campaign that we were wrestling with in our community included the closure of a local elementary school because so many families had moved away. It didn't make sense to keep it open because we couldn't justify the tax expenditure on a school the kids weren't going to anymore. We lost 1 psychiatrist at the mental health unit at the largest regional hospital in northern Nova Scotia, and the mental health unit disappeared forever. If we have professionals and families moving into communities, the rest tends to take care of itself. We've embraced immigration as a community and as a region over the last number of years, and we've seen people coming back to the community. We're not talking about schools closing or hospital services disappearing. We're talking about whether we can build houses quickly enough to accommodate all the people who want to move to my community. Now this is a challenge, but I think challenges associated with growth any day of the week over challenges associated with depopulation. This is something that I think we can share with the rest of the country to demonstrate what success looks like. A lot of people won't probably realize this. The 2 fastest growing cities in this country right now are Moncton and Halifax. Moncton and Halifax are growing faster than Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver. It's unbelievable the life that has been breathed into Atlantic Canada, including in small towns, as a result of immigration. But this demographic trend that we're looking at, despite ambitious immigration levels, is not something we can accept has already been taken care of. Because when we look at the erosion of the workforce down to 2 or 3 workers for a retired person, certainly that's going to create pressures on public revenues to continue to provide the public services that we too often take for granted. But it's also going to leave enormous gaps in the labor force for a generation. Think about the jobs that people my parents' age just retired from. The reality is we're going to continue to see our needs go up on social services as people age, particularly in healthcare. But we're also going to see significant retirements over the next number of years in the Canadian economy. Given the fact that our families are not the same size as my mom's family who grew up with 10 kids, we can't expect that we're going to continue to repopulate the labor force domestically. We know that's not going to happen, and even if we started doing it today, it's going to be 18 years before we have a working age population that would fill the gaps we know are going to exist. Now, if we continue to bring newcomers with the skills we need into the economy, we're going to be able to overcome some of these challenges and continue to outpace growth for our G7 counterparts and most advanced economies in the world. But we have to do it in an intelligent way. We've been hard at work over the past 1.5 years since I've had this job, and no doubt for the years preceding my time in this office, trying to tinker with our immigration policies so we can get the most economic and social return out of the decisions that we take insofar as we continue to welcome large numbers of economic migrants. The kinds of things that we're dealing with now are really exciting. Of course, we're putting more resources into the system to process things more quickly to get that worker here that you need ASAP. And there's been some challenges coming out of the pandemic, but the time to get a work permit is more or less back to what it was before the pandemic as of today. But it's not just processing times, it's the kind of policies that we need to adopt. We're making a major change to the federal express entry system this year. The legal change has been done, we're redesigning the system now. The express entry system, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a system that spits out a score on the basis of your employment history, your education, your language, your age, and a number of other factors. And it's very, very good at welcoming talented newcomers to Canada, but it's never been very good about bringing the people who are in the greatest need. Right now, we need to pull the fire alarm to bring more workers into this country who can help build houses. Later this year, we're going to have a targeted draw that's going to specifically bring the highest scoring newcomers to Canada who have the ability to work in the skilled trades. This is going to be a dedicated strategy that's bringing the skills that we need to help build houses. We can't simply count on the system to sort itself out. We need to be taking decisions that are going to ensure we're bringing the people here who are going to meet the needs of the economy and reduce the pressures facing our system. Now, it's not just processing time, it's not just express entry. We've got a whole slew of programs designed to bring skilled newcomers here. I think about the Employment Mobility Pathways pilot, where we've got people on recruiting missions to find refugees who happen to have essential skills, combining the humanitarian imperative to do right by the world with our own economic self-interest. Because we know that when refugees come to this country, they're carrying a whole lot more than what's in their suitcase. They have talent to contribute. I should know I come from a community where Peace by Chocolate calls home. For those of you who aren't familiar with the story, we had a family who lost their chocolate factory during a bombing in Damascus. And when they were supported by the community, they got a small operation off the ground out of the basement of the home the community provided for them. And they faced some xenophobia, despite the community being overwhelmingly supportive. And I remember hearing Tara Kadad, now a friend of mine and CEO of the company, tell me that the first person who said to him in the community of Antigonish, "I'm sorry what happened to you, but why did you have to come to my town to take my job?" I was the first person Tara hired to work on the shop floor of a factory that now employs 50 people in rural Nova Scotia. The reality is, we stumbled into coincidence and had good luck with the Haddad family. But now we're trying to replicate that experiment on purpose by recognizing through our program design that vulnerable people often have the talents we need. There was a recruitment mission recently in Jordan with representatives from my province in Nova Scotia